Hi everybody, welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here for our 5th Artist Talk in our new series, Visual Voices. This series celebrates diverse perspectives and practices in studio arts and aims to foster dialogue, connection, and inspiration through the lens of contemporary visual artists. This series is free to attend, which has been made possible in part by the generous financial support of the Rochester Area Community Foundation, and will continue monthly with new artists through January 2026. For next month, we have December 6th, G. Peter Jemison. This event is being recorded by our videographer, Maggie. The edited recording will be live on the Flower City Arts Center YouTube channel. At this time, I will remind you to please silence all of your devices. We're thrilled to have Shayna Kiblin with us today. Shayna is a fiber and installation artist based in Rochester, New York. She uses her work to examine her relationship with her identity as a dyke and the role that friendship has played in her queer coming of age. She currently teaches quilting and manages a gallery at the Rochester Institute of Technology. We're so honored to host Shayna this afternoon with us. So please join me in welcoming Shayna Kiblin.
Feels weird to say so. Okay, thank you everybody for coming and for being here while it is sunny out. Thank you also to Flower City, thank you to Jacob. Thank you for everyone who came to my show here last month. And also there's a really cool show downstairs called Mixed Media that Jacob and I and some other people helped to curate and organize. So today we're going to talk about some of my work. We're going to go back a little bit and then come back to what I'm doing now. And we'll see how it goes. So I am from Buffalo, New York. Originally I went to undergrad for fine art photography, and then I got my MFA in studio fine art. During my undergrad, I found out very quickly that I was not a photographer, and that was not for me. So here's some photos that I took from my neighborhood from when I was like 18, I think. Just to kind of like place that I'm from, somewhere very gray and grim, just like Rochester.
Your hands in front of the screen.
My hands in front of the screen. Okay, so going into my fiber art from there, I started with fiber art kind of formally while I was in undergrad around 2018. I had some background in fiber art, mostly with embroidering. When I was in high school, I made a lot of my own clothes and kind of wanted to customize stuff, so I learned embroidery and kind of went from there. So this piece from 2018 was called Heavy. This is the first piece that kind of set me off on the course of where I ended up to where I am now. Even though I don't really like this piece that much, I kind of very surface level, but I was 20 years old at the time, so of course it was. Had to make that to get to where I am now. Yeah, this has just kind of set the tone for how I've come, left photography, and got more into sculpture and fiber art. So starting in 2021, I started my MFA at RIT in studio fine art, which was great. I graduated undergrad during the pandemic, and I didn't really know what to do with my life. Every job I applied to no longer existed. And so I thought, you know what, why not go to grad school? That's what everybody does these days. And so I started grad school in 2021. So this is the first piece I made, having formal sculpture training, kind of being in class for sculpture. I did a little bit of sculpture when I was in grad school, but I kind of struggled. It was ugly. I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody told me what to do. And I was working with like random materials, whatever I could get for free kind of. So being more of an adult in grad school and having money and kind of having a better artistic vision of what I wanted to do was very helpful. So this piece was called Net. It's made out of like a couple hundred pom-poms that my friends and I all handmade over the course of about a month. It was a really nice community building exercise to rope all of my friends into helping me make something that wouldn't have been possible by myself. It was kind of a practice in just doing the same thing over and over again, which I think with most art practice, you end up just doing the same thing over and over again, but with like sewing and fiber art, I feel like it tends to happen a lot, especially with what I do. So moving forward, these are two more sculptures, also from 2021. They're called Blank 1 and 2, one being on the left, two being on the right. And this is when I started to kind of explore bodily forms in art. I knew I wanted to create stuff that was overwhelmingly welcoming with both the colors and the materials. I started making rugs in like 2019. I had a tufting gun, and at that time it like there wasn't that much online about it, so it was everything I was doing was very messy. I didn't know what I was doing. And again, that is the story of a lot of how I ended up to where I am, is not knowing what I'm doing, figuring it out as I go. And so this is when I kind of really started to like make the material work for me, when I started to really embrace fiber arts more and more. So these two pieces are kind of made up of two parts each. There's like the top, which I would call the body, and then the bottom, which is just the pedestal. The idea of the bodies came first. I knew I wanted to make these like very human-esque forms. They're 5 feet and 6 feet tall respectively. And when I made just the like body part, it felt out of place. Once I like put it on the floor, I put it on a pedestal. I didn't really like how it went immediately into kind of white space. And so I wanted to make these custom pedestals that would match the aesthetic of the forms themselves. So I made some more rugs and covered these plywood boxes with it for these sculptures to sit on. And I like that I kind of situated themselves within the gallery space, or my studio, a little bit better. So, going forward, I'm going to talk about my thesis show a little bit from 2022. I worked on my thesis from about like May of 2021 to March of 2022. So this is all being made over the span of like 9 to 10 months. My thesis show is called Pillow Princess. It was made up of 3 quilts and 6 soft sculptures. And this body of work, I wanted to use various fiber processes to explore my identity as a lesbian and kind of where I sit in the queer space. I was really focused on the bedroom and intimacy, and so I wanted to create this space that had a bedroom-ish feeling. There's also a lot with like textiles being inherently intimate objects almost, especially quilting, because these are things that lay on beds, they lay on couches. They're things that we all have a lot of familiarity with. And at this point in time too, I kind of really started situating myself in a queer community. My like coming out is that I was kind of vaguely bisexual throughout high school, but I only dated men. And then around 2019, I realized I was a lesbian. And then from there is when I started really interacting with the queer community versus just like identifying as a queer person. I think there's a big difference in being an active member of a community versus just being kind of vaguely queer. So at this point, I kind of leaned in. All of my friends by this point were gay mostly, and we were exploring what community meant to us all in our young adult lives. So these pieces are all exploring the home and body, and I'm using iconography that rather than explicitly relates to queerness itself, I'm referencing things like sex toys, I'm referencing kind of altar-ish pieces, stained glass all through these soft materials. And here's another installation view just to kind of situate it. So these are 2 quilts from that show. They're the first 2 pieces that I made that I think kind of informed this body of work, called Rabbit and Hitachi, Rabbit being on the left, Hitachi being on the right. And I knew when I was making these, I wanted to reference materials and forms that were sexual, but I didn't want it to be super overt. I didn't want it to be super explicit. And I also knew that I wanted to kind of create this altar to my sexuality, an altar to my friends almost, an altar to my girlfriend at the time, who's not my wife. And so these shapes are both simple and abstract in a way. I think sex toys are vaguely abstract. I've had people think these are dog toys, which I think is very funny. And every time I show these, I'm shocked by the amount of people who don't know what they are, which is fine. It's just very funny to me because I thought these were the 2 like most obvious kind of sex toy forms. So this is the 3rd quilt of this series, and then I also want to show them like this. This is how I showed them at a solo show I had in January at UB. This is kind of the idea I had in my mind when I was making them and how I wanted to show them. In my thesis show, we just worked in the space a little bit differently. But I had this like altar vision that kind of was like these 2 on the side, 1 in the middle. And so this piece called Pleaser came after the first 2. I knew I wanted to connect the walls and the floor in some way. Going back to kind of this installation view, I wanted the quilts to interact with the sculptures in a more literal way than just kind of being like partnered on the wall on the ground. And so I also wanted to challenge myself to make something huge. At this point, the last two quilts I showed were the first two like art quilts I made. Up to that point, a lot of the quilting I was doing, I don't know, I see more as craft than art. I see it kind of more as like, I'm just making things for my home, for me, versus like having intention about why I'm making things. And so this ended up being 4 feet wide by 11 feet long. Like the other two, it's also referencing a bunch of different sex toys. These ones being a little bit more niche. They're all from like lesbian specific sex toy companies. And then I wanted to partner those with super traditional quilting. So I've appliqued these sex toys onto traditional quilt blocks. There's this tradition in quilting of like sewing circles or groups of women when one of them would move away, of all the women coming together and sewing these blocks. And everyone would like make 1 or 2 of these like star blocks and they'd sew them together into one big community quilt to send their friend away with. And I thought that was a really, I thought that's a very beautiful tradition that's kind of lost these days because we keep up with everyone on social media, so we didn't need to do that. So, where am I, sorry? Okay, and all these quilts are referencing stained glass. I didn't grow up religious, and I think when you're working with the idea of stained glass and altar, it's very easy for it to start getting into the religious aspect, and I was trying to avoid that. But being from Buffalo, I did grow up around a bunch of Frank Lloyd Wright stained glass and Frank Lloyd Wright houses. I had friends who had this beautiful like geometric stained glasses in their house growing up, and my friends and I would quite frequently go hang out at the Darwin Martin house in Buffalo, which is filled with beautiful geometric stained glass. So that's kind of what I was referencing within stained glass, more than wanting it to feel like explicitly religious. So, moving on to some of these sculptures from this time. All of these sculptures are just called Pillow Princess, and they're numbered 1 through 5, just in chronological order. They were made 2 different ways. The first way that I was making them was I was hand latch hooking all of them, so I was basically tying knots for every single piece of yarn on these for the first two I made, and then being in grad school and having a deadline, that was not working time-wise. So I pivoted, and then some of them I ended up using a sewing machine, cutting a bunch of strips of yarn, pinning them down, and just running through the sewing machine over and over again for hours every day. And that was kind of making the textiles, so I was making these big flat planes of kind of like color, and then I was taking those and I was sewing them into different shapes and forms. Some of these are made using like 6 panels, which is something that I hadn't done before with sewing. So it was fun to kind of figure out how exactly to construct these when I'm also now working with like 20 pounds of material because they're all covered with yarn. So it was a bit of a difficult process, but I'm really happy with how these came out. The pieces are mostly stuffed using polyfill, and then also scraps from my studio floor, because I would shave down all of these sculptures, I cut all of this yarn, and I felt really bad about throwing it out. And so I kind of keep it all in a bucket to use for something one day. And this is where most of it ended up going. So this one is Pillow Princess 5. This is the last one I made. Like my big quilt called Pleaser, after I made all the other ones, I wanted to challenge myself to try to make something as big as possible. And so this one ended up being about 10 feet long. And with all of these, with the colors, I was using mass-produced, already pre-dyed yarn. So I was using materials that felt very familiar to me. It's stuff that I would craft with as a kid. And it was kind of letting me play with femininity in a way that I didn't in my own life. I've never seen myself as a feminine person, especially at that point, a little less so now. But I wasn't explicitly feminine, and also with being a lesbian, there's kind of this like conflict between femininity and lesbian identity, and that like, I'm a femme, but that doesn't mean I'm like feminine. I'm femme in like the femme-butch dynamic. And I was just starting to kind of learn what that meant. I was just starting to learn lesbian history, and all of this started kind of informing my idea of myself, and therefore these sculptures. Sometimes I like to talk about these sculptures almost as being like a drag, as kind of playing with hyper-femininity through them, and that's how I kind of started to like put myself in these sculptures, because also I feel a very intimate tie with these sculptures. They were taking me so long to make that it is like I'm kind of part of them. This one, Pillow Princess 3, this one's my favorite one because it's stuffed exclusively with scraps from my studio floor. And because it's like literally just garbage, it's really fun to kind of like move it around and pose. Posing these sculptures is something that's really important in the work. Every time I show them, I'm kind of doing something different. It's also fun when I send them off to galleries and then their gallery employees are posing them. I tell them they can do whatever feels right to them. When they interact together sometimes, it's like two bodies kind of connecting versus when they're on their own, they get their own kind of personality. Like this one I think is very sad feeling versus when she's with her friend. And this is Pillow Princess 2. So this is one of those ones that were 6 panels, and I kind of wanted to show it and get more of a, you can't ever get like a full 360 view unless you're like hanging from the ceiling, obviously, but I kind of wanted to stick it in the corner and kind of have it all piling down to give it like a loft texture. And this is the last sculpture from this series that I'm going to talk about. This one is called Holes. You'll see that I title work really bad, not badly, but I title work very literally, and then at some point I just start getting crazy, which is fine. So I made these after I finished all those last sculptures that were like big and shaggy, because I felt like I was missing something. Some of them were feeling really phallic to me because they were these giant tubes, and I wanted to make something to complement that. And so I thought, what would complement something phallic? A hole. And so these I think of also as being butch in terms of like a butch femme dynamic. I made them, I went back to making rugs with the tufting gun, and then I like closely cropped it down. So I think of them as like having their heads shaved. And also within this space itself, this one is kind of situated as a like transitional piece as you come around the corner, which I almost didn't include it in my thesis, but I have this massive wall now all of a sudden that I didn't have at first. So I wanted to kind of connect it, and it felt like a good transition into this kind of like tighter space. Okay, so now I left grad school and I was really sick of the color hot pink. And I said, what can I now do that isn't hot pink? And so I started doing these kind of like material studies at first. I started using different material. Up to this point, all of my quilting had been like very technical. Everything would be like really mapped out at first and measured and mathematically correct. And I needed a break from doing all of that. And so I started just buying random material and cutting it up and sewing it together. I almost think of these as like collages, how I was working with them. And they led up to this bigger piece called Love Letter to My Butch Girlfriend, which is made using a ton of materials that I kind of thought as having a butch connotation, as well as just traditional quilting cotton, which is my own kind of self going into this piece. So it's made using some of my now wife's clothes, nylon ripstop, which is like a camping material. I got like decommissioned rugby balls from our college rugby team that I was playing with, carabiner, lavender from our garden that I like to stick in every time I show it. And this piece too, I started experimenting with improv quilting, so here's some in progress pictures of how I made this. So again, this is kind of the first time. I don't know exactly what I'm making is gonna look like at the end, so I started making these smaller compositions that were about like 8 by 8 to 16 by 6-ish inches, and I kept those in a stack, and once I had a bunch, I taped out on the floor. I knew I wanted it to be like 48 by 36 inches or whatever. I started just putting these blocks around and moving them around and making new ones to fill in gaps, and just kept building it out more and more. And while I was doing this too, the collaging aspect started coming in. I started adding pockets here or there, adding the rugby ball. I added like a strap harness type thing that I made out of some like old leather. The carabiner that my keys were on forever is on there now. And yeah, it was really fun to like finally kind of let go a little bit and like not stick to super strict quilting rules. Not that I ever had to do that, it's just I liked working like that for a while. And that's something I find out myself a lot. I go back and forth between making a lot of really technical quilts and being like, okay, I can't do math for like 3 months, I need to do something else. And so between Love Letter to My Butch Girlfriend I made in 2022 and And I kind of took a year off of like finishing anything because I was sick of wanting all these like fully realized projects. I felt like it was kind of stifling to me too, because I felt this like pressure to finish giant pieces. Like I don't make small work for the most part. I like need to make stuff that's at least 3 feet big. And so I took a year off to just like explore a lot of different things. And then I came back to this kind of technical quilting aspect where I was making text quilts. All of the letters are patterns that I drafted myself, so I have a whole alphabet ready now for whenever I need to make a new one. So this piece is called, I've been having this recurring dream where you DM me, a meme from 2016. I usually shorten it because that kind of feels insane sometimes. And it's this piece that I made when I was in it came out of being in my early 20s, kind of going into my mid to late 20s, and realizing that like the people in my life who I thought would be in my life always aren't, and that's not necessarily a negative thing, but it was a thing that I definitely was coping with really hard. I had a falling out with my best friend from high school, and it was we had this queer teenage friendship, you know? If you know, you know. It's kind of like we were really tied, and we came of age together, and kind of as we like grew apart, we became different people. It was something that I always felt bad about. It felt like I was a bad person almost for like letting this beautiful friendship fall apart, which isn't what happened, but there was a lot of guilt I felt, and I also felt a lot of guilt about having this obsessive thought about like, please don't hurt me. At the same time too, I was actually, right after I finished this quilt, I started exposure therapy for my OCD, which makes sense, because I kept kind of ruminating on this thing of like, this relationship meant so much to me, and what does it mean to you? I'll have no idea because we don't talk anymore. And so this piece, the quilting on this piece, and when I say quilting too, I mean, over here's like a detail shot, so the quilting's like the actual like, sewing those 3 layers of fabric together. So the actual quilting on this piece is of a letter that I wrote after, so this reoccurring dream is real. I keep having this dream where I woke up and my phone, I had a DM on Instagram from her. That was this like meme we were obsessed with. And after like the 4th time this happened, I woke up and I was like, okay, this is like getting insane. And so I like left my room and I went and sat down and I kind of wrote this letter as if I was addressing her directly. And I had to get it all out of my system. And that is what I ended up quilting onto here. So I wanted the writing to feel hasty. It's something that people sometimes try to read. I witness people reading it, and I think you can read it. It's very messy though. I wanted there to be this kind of intimacy between the piece and the viewer, and kind of the viewer's decision to either take it at face value or spend the time with it to try to read it, to understand it. And also within the quilt itself, right around here, you can like very vaguely see it, but the actual letter I wrote, I put in the quilt so that I would never have to see it again. So coming right off of that, I made this piece called Thank You for Keeping Me Alive. Another text piece, obviously. I felt like I was onto something with using quilting and text art in this way of like kind of hiding messages within the quilting, and I wanted to try to do more with that. And I also wanted to try being like less selfish. Not that I think that thinking please don't hurt me is inherently selfish. I think it's a very human thought. I think everybody, like I get a lot of conversation about that piece because it feels very human, I think. But personally, it always felt selfish to me, and so I was like, I need to do something that feels less selfish. So this is kind of a thank you to all the people in my life who have helped me not be so sad about life. And it is quilted with the names of about 20 or so of my friends from the past 15 years. Some of them I don't talk to anymore. Some of them I have like a falling out with and will probably never talk to again. But it felt important to kind of include everybody who's been in my life. I think it's really beautiful how people kind of weave in throughout your life, right? Like I have best friends now who I knew 10 years ago who we didn't talk and then we became friends. And just kind of figuring out relationships when you're in your mid-20s is something that felt a little bit complicated to me, and these pieces helped me work through that. Because when you're young, it just feels like your friends are your friends, and then also like being, not that Buffalo's like a small town, but like my siblings, all of their friends were their friends from high school, so for a bit it kind of felt like I was a failure for like not maintaining these like decades-long relationships. but that's not my course in life, and that's fine. And around the time that I made this in the last piece too, I listened to this podcast of this guy who called everybody in his contact list on his phone. And he's like me, and I've never deleted a contact from my phone, and I've had a phone since I was like 12 years old. So he called like 15 years worth of contacts from his phone, like exes, ex-friends, like people who think it's insane that he's calling them. I became like obsessed with this idea. I was like, I can never do that. But like, how can I do that in a non-invasive way? And I came up with a lot of ideas, and who knows, maybe I'll like go forward with one of them one day. But this is kind of the closest to that thing that I felt comfortable getting. But I think about that podcast all the time because I accidentally called the wrong Hannah, not my wife, the other day, and I was like, oh no. It's like, I did not mean to call you, I haven't talked to you in 20 years. And around the same time as this too, I mean, since 2015, this is gonna get a little depressing, but like since 2015 and they, legalized gay marriage, there's been like a boot on queer people's neck to like take away whatever else can get ripped away. And there's all these like transphobic and homophobic policies getting passed or getting introduced every day. And the political rhetoric right now makes queer people kill themselves, quite frankly. And the only way that personally we can move through that is by building community. And I'm really proud of myself and my friends for building a community where we feel comfortable talking to each other and where I think all of my friends are as safe as they can possibly be. So yeah, I think community building is also something that comes up, especially in my work now. The further I get into being part of a queer community, the more vital that it becomes apparent that is so vital. Okay, now we're jumping. So this is a piece called "If I Paid You $30, We Could Put This in Your Gallery," and it says "Masturbating to the NYFA, Opportunity Ads, NYFA is the New York Federation of the Arts." It is a great organization that gives money to artists, but they also have this section of their website where there's artist opportunities, and that's where you'll find open calls to shows and residencies and things like that. And so I've been applying to stuff on this website since I was an undergrad. And when I made this piece, I was doing this series of presentations for my friends that I called Shard History. And each presentation is focused on a different bodily fluid and contemporary artists who would use those bodily fluids. So when I made this, I was making a PowerPoint about contemporary artists who use masturbating in their work, like Vito Conche, Marina Abramovic, or Robert Rauschenberg. And then I was like, this is funny. And at the same time too, it's being a working artist is really hard. And this piece is really funny, but it comes down to kind of time management and the difficulty of being a working artist, because since I've been 16, at any given time I've been working 1 to 4 jobs. And then especially since leaving grad school, it's okay, now I've got a desk job and a teaching job, and then whatever freelance work comes up. And then on top of that, I have to be a good partner, I have to be a good friend, and keep up with the horrors of the news every day. And then I also need to make good and time-consuming work, which I'm then writing about and reading about and submitting to places, and I'm writing applications, and I'm paying fees to maybe show work. And all of the administrative parts of being an artist is very difficult, and it's something that I think is a reason why a lot of artists end up falling off of it, because it feels like my art is important to show, and so I go that route, but not all artists go that route. But yeah, I did not realize before being a real adult how difficult it is to make your self-made work. And so at the end of the day, this is about making my self-made work. And yeah. So moving on to what I'm doing kind of now in the past 6 months. So this is a piece called Concept of a Plan. It is hand embroidered. The middle is hand embroidered, and the rest is machine pieced and quilted. After the new Trump administration started, I wanted to make work that felt political. I mean, my work has always been political in that my identity as a queer person has been politicized so much, so my work has to be political. But now I wanted to make work that was supposed to be political. And so I was playing with this idea of these like DIY weapons or DIY ways that people are fighting police or state violence every day and have throughout history. So I started making these diagrams of DIY weapons for now. So quilting has a long history of being political. Throughout history, quilts have been used in different political ways. There's like folklore about quilts being used in the Underground Railroad as like, there's like quilt codes, which there's debate if any of that's true on both ends. But I'm interested in the folklore aspect and the fact that like crafting does have this political history in America. I use this sawtooth star because I think it's a very classic Americana, like traditional aesthetic, and it's one of the quilt blocks that may or may not have been used in the Underground Railroad. And I really liked the contrast here of making these like having these hard weapons mixed with this like satiny, shiny, soft fabric, and these patterns that have been used in quilting for decades and decades and decades. Here's another piece from that series. This one is a Molotov cocktail, which have been used for, again, decades in leftist revolutions. I wanted to contrast the domestic with kind of the horrors that are happening in the world every day. The world's becoming increasingly hostile to everybody. Every day there's a new group of people who it's becoming hostile to, and it feels bad. And making work like this kind of felt good to me. Not that it feels like I'm doing much, but it felt good to like do something that I felt was important and was relevant to what's happening now. And now to end, a little bit more chill than that, I'm going to talk about the other aspect of my practice. I kind of have this like two sides of my art practice where I'm making like art, like capital A art, and then I'm making like clothes and kind of crafts, which are still art and they're still just as time consuming, but I view them differently. So when I am not making capital A art, then I'm making clothes for my dogs. I'm not going to show that, but I do it. So here is a vest I made. I did a lot of hand embroidery on it and kind of mixing it with piecing. This is this growing work now actually. I made it out of a bunch of like tests that I did. So I do a bunch of tests in my work. I'll like test embroider things. I test stuff on the machine a lot. I got like this stack of really beautiful things that I don't know what to do with. And so I took that stack of beautiful things and I made a skirt with it. And then I'll show one more little piece of clothing that I made recently. That is another vest. I used a lot of hand embroidery. It feels like good to kind of have this balance in myself of like, okay, I like to make my clothes, I like to make my art. It kind of helps me like get into a mind space of when I want to make something. It's like, how hard do I want to think about what I'm making? Especially after the fact. But that is everything. Questions?
Feel free to jump in with a question. Or I will. Can you talk a little bit about pop culture as it results to your work? I feel like that's something that I just know about knowing you personally.
Yeah.
In your work.
Yeah, that's a great question actually. Yeah, so especially I'm gonna go back to when, let's see. When I was working on my thesis, I feel like pop culture it definitely gets lost in this, but it's kind of in the background of everything, specifically with my thesis too. But I'm a cheerleader, the like, I don't know, I think 2001 film classic. It's like a campy queer movie about conversion therapy camp, if you don't know. It satirizes conversion therapy. It like plays into gender roles in a really interesting way of how like women are supposed to be, how men are supposed to be. And that campiness and just queer campiness in general, like drag, but I'm a cheerleader. I have like a list of kind of these like pop cultural things that influence me. A little less so now than it used to, I think. But I'm really interested in how queerness is depicted, especially in mainstream culture, in like the background of shows when there's a queer character, things like that. I like to see how those are depicted, and it's kind of crazy because it gets worse now. Like, everything used to be funny. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Shayna. How do you feel like the tension between like very domestic feminine craft work like quilting and embroidery like relates to your queer identity, especially as a lesbian that is kind of outside of that traditional like feminine role?
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I've always kind of been tied to. It's also, I think a lot of people assume because I'm a textile artist that like my mom or my grandma probably taught me how to quilt or something. That's not the case. Everything I've learned has been like on YouTube or like a college class here and there. And I think that first of all too, there is like a queer renaissance happening in fiber art right now, which is really cool. I think a lot of queer people are called to fiber art because it's one of those things that's rejected from the traditional art world, maybe a little less so now, but historically, there's been this like big divide in craft and art. And fiber arts being so feminine and domestic, I think has gotten the shorter end of the stick compared to like woodworking or ceramics maybe. Because those are things where it's like big and you get dirty and you're like punching stuff all the time or something. Versus like, you're just like, cutting stuff up and sewing. I think that it's been really feminized. And I think that the comeback it's making is really cool. I think too, it's like people, me included in this, are making like big fiber art. There's this artist, Shayna Kiblin, I think she just goes by Pepe now actually, who was really influential to me. She still works, she worked like in the early 2000s. She makes these like giant kind of like crochet nets. And she works with, she'll like go into college and work with students too to like community make these. And I think there's an inherent queerness in working like that and working in community and like making your art with other people, especially when it's in these settings. Like when I make art with my friends, it's so based in community. And so I think there's this interesting tie between like, where am I going with this? Like the femininity inherent in fiber art is also inherently queer to me, and it's always been inherently queer. Also because fiber art too has like always been used in politics in some way throughout the world, and so I'm kind of interested in how fiber art has varied so much. I just went over like 8 topics.
I mean, I guess this discussion makes me think about the AIDS Memorial Quilt as
Yes.
one of the most public and first really queer art exhibits in this sense, right? Do you think about the AIDS Memorial Quilt in any way? Do you see any ties between this resurgence of fiber arts in the queer community and
Yeah.
quilt?
Yeah, there's definitely, I think that being something that exists that is also I've seen pieces of it at least in different exhibitions. And I know it was originally displayed too on the White House lawn. And it's something that I've thought about. I don't think it doesn't play a main role in my art, but it's one of those things where there's a lot of queer fiber art that's kind of in the background of knowing it exists helps me make my work, and it kind of puts, it sets the scene for queer art too. So it's this quilt existing helps more queer quilts exist. And so even if mine and maybe other queer fiber artists now, queer quilters, aren't necessarily looking at that super literally, it's definitely coming from that. Especially with how political that is. Again, it ties to the super political history of quilting.
Did you, how would you describe how you sort of stumbled into this line of work? Did you have a mentor, or is it just something you came across in a book and decided to try yourself?
A little bit of both. I'd say largely I came into this because I wanted clothes in high school that I couldn't have, and so I started embroidering and beading stuff. And then that started becoming, when I went into photo school, I started kind of combining embroidery with photography. I was kind of forcing the two together. I think people do it successfully, but I was just doing it because I was in photo school, and I didn't want to be in photo school, I wanted to be a fiber artist. And so I started doing that, and then eventually I got to take a quilting class at RIT, and that kind of is where I really hit the ground running with knowing what to do, because before that I didn't know how to use a sewing machine. It was something that I found difficult to learn by myself. And so having that class, and I ended up taking that class all throughout college, or all throughout grad school too, really helped me kind of like embrace this as an art and kind of lean heavier into this. And then on top of this, there is a lot of like, yeah, when I was in school, I spent like a minimum of like 2 hours a week in the library, in the like textile art section, just pulling books and looking through stuff. And so all of that time I spent there definitely helped inform where I'm at now. Seeing all this art and like having an idea of fiber art history specifically helped me a lot with like situating myself kind of in this field and knowing where I want to go, what I want to do.
How do you sort of deal with the fact that sometimes quilting can be a hobby for a very sort of niche kind of right room community of grandma, old woman kind of thing?
Yeah, I just like to not think about it. I mean, it's like in the same way, right? There's like those people who paint Trump, it's really funny, and they're kind of bad a lot of the time. But there's always artists who make bad art, and sometimes bad art isn't necessarily art that's like compositionally or technically bad. It's just art that I don't like who's making it, and they have bad politics. And so, like, there's definitely, I mean, like, if you look at like flags being made, it's like someone made the Confederate flag, right? Someone sewed that, and it's kind of just like in the history of it. But I like to look at more of a, I like to look at the history of quilting through like a more like a leftist lens, where I'm not like ignoring the bad stuff, but the good kind of inherently outweighs the bad, especially with like what we see now with things like, you know, the AIDS quilt and stuff like that. It kind of the quilting that we talk about now is usually politically more liberal, I think.
I have one more question. Would you consider then like the move of quilting into more leftist spaces to be kind of like a subversion or a reclamation of the American tradition of textile arts?
Yeah, definitely. I think too, like going back to this, like I think there's like a queer kind of renaissance happening within the fiber art community as a whole. I think it is this reclamation, and it's something that almost we can make our own because it's not like the history of paint. I'm not saying there's no history of quilting, but it's not like the history of painting or the history of like sculpture or the history of like ceramics where it like is very well known and spans a lot. I think especially quilting. I mean, fiber arts, there's like weavings, you know, things like that are more historic. But because so many quilts have been lost too, they're not necessarily objects that hold up super well for like, you know, centuries and centuries, that it's easy for queer people to kind of like make it their own and kind of come together to have this like new age of queer quilting specifically. I mean, fiber art in general, but like I see there's new queer quilters coming up on my Instagram every day that I don't know about, and I think that's really cool.
What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's looking towards art to be more expressive of who they are?
Advice.
Like,
I
more
think,
getting
like,
into the space.
Yeah, I think what really helped me is not even necessarily sketching or drawing. For a while, especially in high school and early college, I felt difficult thinking of myself as an artist because I don't draw very well, I don't paint, I don't do the things that are seen as traditionally like art. But I found a lot of success with writing. I like to just make a list of words. Sometimes I don't know like what I want to do. I'll start making a list of words. If there's like a topic that I want to play with or a theme I want to play around with. Going to Jacob's question about pop culture, like a lot of my work will come from, I make these like giant word charts where I'm just writing down all of these things from pop culture, and then I'm tying that to like, you know, some kind of niche artist from the 80s, and I'm tying that to something else, and I'm tying that to something else. I make these big word webs, and then I take that and kind of start playing that into my art, and I don't even do that with the text pieces, which is funny. The text pieces are kind of just things that I think of, kind of Jenny Holzer style, versus like these pieces you wouldn't think that much writing, or that they were based in words, but these pieces are all actually like based in words that I've been writing, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think also like, you know, sketching and stuff, comes into play. I sketch like, because again, I'm not like super, I don't like drawing that much. So like I sketch by making these like tiny quilts all the time, or like, you know, I draw on the sewing machine using like an embroidery attachment where I can just kind of like move around. And so I like to just make smaller sketches like that and not necessarily think of things in terms of like a final piece. But I go back and forth with kind of working between the two of like having a plan versus just like playing around for a while.
I think looking at your work, a common thread is a lot of your subject matter is things that aren't necessarily welcome in public.
Yeah.
Sex, violence, raw emotion.
Yes.
I was wondering if that defiance is an active decision, or is that just sort of where your interests lie?
It's an active decision in that like I actually decide that's where my interests lie, you know? And I think too, like, I mean, everything kind of ties back to being queer. Like my friends and I are like, the way that I joke with queer people, and I guess nowadays I don't have that much of a reference versus how like I used to be in my like, you know, straighter kind of friend groups that were less community oriented feeling. Versus now, I think that I get a lot of freedom from, you know, being in queer community, and that kind of emboldens me to make these things that are like relatively inappropriate. And they're inappropriate in like a specific way, right? Because there's like nude painting, which doesn't feel as explicit as like my sex toy quilts. Because there's like, what's the reason behind it? Like a sex toy is an inherently sexual object versus like a naked body is just a naked body. And so I do make an active decision to be like that. And yeah, I think it's just because like I'm in a place in life where like I'm surrounded by people who kind of, I feel safe talking about these things, and it's people who have similar sexual experiences to me and that kind of thing. And with the violence stuff, which is more of what I'm doing now, that I'm just emboldened to make because I look around and the world is so violent, and the world is so violent against like people who I love and the people who matter the most to me, that like, not to say I want to commit an act of violence, but like making the art kind of feels violent in that way, where it's like, I'm not, like there's nothing that I can do really right now. It feels like we can't do anything. And so making this art that isn't even, again, it's also the kind of thing where it's like, there's definitely art that's more explicitly violent versus just like a diagram of how to make a guillotine. But that's how I want to approach the violence, I guess, because I don't want to approach it in any like real material way or any like way that feels that like in a way that like I want to do that, you know? I just want to like get it out of my system, and then like embroidery and quilting is kind of a good outlet to do so right now.
Would you share a little bit about lessons learned from building queer community?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson is that not everybody, my community isn't just who I talk to every day or even every week, right? The community kind of grows, and then at a certain point it's like a friend of a friend of a friend is somebody who I'm friends with in a way, even if I only know them because we're like mutuals on Instagram or something, which is also, there's also like this great thing now, this great horrible thing about social media where it's like horrible, but like it's really cool because I found a lot of great queer people, and especially like I found like, you know, a queer quilting community on there that I wouldn't be necessarily as privy to it that way. I just know like the 3 people in Rochester who are queer people who quilt who I know, right? So I think knowing people who know people who know people, and then knowing that I would help that person is kind of like my biggest thing, especially going back to which piece? This. So like this piece, all the people on here, like again, there's people on here who I don't talk to anymore. There's people on here who I like had kind of backbones out with, but if any of them called me and needed me to like pick them up from somewhere at 2 a.m., right, I answer the phone and I would go do it. Because at the end of the day, like these are queer people, and I don't care. I don't care what situation that we had. I care more that a queer person is being safe, that safe than that we don't like each other for some reason. So I think too, just like understanding that you don't need to like everybody in your community necessarily, which sounds kind of mean, not like them, but like I don't have to love everybody in my community. I just need to know that they're there and that I would protect them if I need to, and that they're there if I need to talk to them and things like that.
Okay, I have a random question, but it comes from like seeing the three quotes from your MFA show, like, and you said, okay, here's how they were displayed in Buffalo, that I kind of originally wanted them to look like this, but because of the space requirements, like,
Yeah.
I couldn't do that originally, like, it just got me wondering, like, is there a space that you would love to see your work go in terms of the gallery or a museum or an event, or, and it could be either in terms of the physical attributes of that space or like the audience that you think you could reach there. Like,
Yeah.
what would your dream showing space be?
Yeah. I don't know if like I think of a space specifically, but I think kind of like what Jacob and I helped do downstairs, like a show of just queer art is something that I love. I'd love to be part of just more queer art shows. For a while, I felt complicated about being a queer artist. I felt complicated about existing in the space where I had to be a queer artist. But then at a certain point, it's like, okay, but I love queer people, and I think my work works better in conversation with queer work. Not that my work doesn't work in conversation with other work, but I think my work makes the most sense if it's surrounded by other work by queer artists. So I think like some kind of queer fiber art show specifically of like a handful of artists who I could think of would be like my dream situation. That's a good question, I think, too.